And what's interesting here is that we have a non-author. Like, here's a really closed text. This is what hermeneutic scholars call a closed text, because we don't know who she is. Like, maybe it's not a woman. Maybe it's a number of people, writing. Maybe it's one person writing and a committee dictating. Like, who knows? Maybe it's a guy. Maybe it's a woman who's in her 60s and says, "No, I'm a young woman in my 20s." We don't know, right? We can't tell. We simply don't know. I suspect there really is a person who took up the identity of Riverbend, created this identity from everything I've read, but we don't know. I haven't ever read anything. I'm trying to remember whether I've read an interview with somebody who has actually met her. I suspect that the publishers, one of the university presses, right, not Kentucky, but one of the university presses that published New Jersey, something in the Northeast, they probably dealt with the actual author, to get the rights. But you could also just publish the web stuff. What was she going to do? Sue you? So we can't authenticate anything that she says. And remember that basically in this particular environment, gossip effectively can also be a news source. And okay, so we have to pay close attention to all the things that O'Brien warned us about. But that's true for any narrative, right? It doesn't matter what it is. You start thinking, the thing is, you have to get out of the mindset of thinking, this is a safe narrative. It's like, there are no safe narratives. A Hollywood film, a speech by the president, an editorial by somebody you trust or believe in at the New York Times or the Globe and Mail or the Financial Post or whatever blog you're reading. It's like every text is up for grabs. Every text must be interpreted. That is, you must look at it and begin to assess and evaluate what kind of information is it, what are the stakes, and so on. All the things that I've been talking about. So if you think that this daily dose of reality is like, oh, well, that must be real, it's like, pause, And it's useful that soon after she began writing her blog, a very pro-American blog spoofed her version of her narrative, which she addresses. And this appeared at blogger.com, which I suspect is now gone. At the time, Power Blogger was a big thing. I think it's gone. But it was an early force in social media, and they refused to help. Because people said to them, this is a spoof of a real thing. And they were like, we're just the platform. We've heard this before, right? I mean, now we're very, very familiar with the beginning of this argument about, we just provide the service. We just, we don't mediate the content. It's like, okay. So she's a very bright, passionate, funny person, and her disappearance into, of all places, at the end of the text, Syria. This is where she's going. This is where they're finally leave. Iraq, which is, after you've read, it's like, oh God, you read the books, and where are they going? Syria. Oh Jesus, and the war in Syria was about, well, at this point, it was about 3 years from cranking up and turning into this incredible schmear that it's turned into. And so we know, well, the last time I checked, what we knew that she was, according to all the sources and blah, 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 was that she was back in Iraq, and that she at least had survived this trip into Syria. But we otherwise don't really know. And if you look up Riverbend, because, I hope that what will happen as you read her is you're like, well, what became of her? Is we don't know. She stopped writing because she presumably came to the end of her thing. She'd said what she had to say. She'd written out this narrative, and she was done with that. And I hope that she was able to go back to work. I hope that she was able to do the things she wanted to do. I hope that she was able to protect her family. I hope that she was content or able to find peace. For yeah. So we can count on Riverbend to give us these little crucial but tiny details about the war, which otherwise I think as Westerners we just don't think about. So she says, Will asked if Valium had become addictive after the war. Of course it has. Valium is a staple during wars. This is Riverbend 2, so the second book, page 8. She also, and this is such a fine point that people are like, oh, somehow they're just, again, working with World War II narratives usually. Oh, well, the people who suffered through the war, they just suffered. It's like, well, they didn't. They committed suicide. They drank because the essentially the drug of choice, which was available. We just don't think it's a drug because it's just normalized. Alcohol. Oh, yeah, fine. So people drank to excess. They smoked. If they could get, depending on where they were, they smoked marijuana, they smoked opium. If they could get it, again, it tended to have to be in big cities. They used cocaine. People used any drug. They used absinthe, which had oil of wormwood in it, which destroys your brain, which was eventually rendered or declared illegal, but people went on drinking it, which is very powerful. So it's like, do people need Valium? Do 8-year-olds need Valium in war? You bet. They're going to sleep? Valium. She is also an excellent observer of her own situation. And the only document I've read recently that comes close to this irony that she has is a particular famous, no longer anonymous diary called A Woman in Berlin. And it was written by, at the time, a woman who was anonymous, who survived the Russian overthrow of Berlin, because there was a race basically for Berlin at the very end of the war, at the very end of the European War. So the Americans and the Russians were racing to get to Berlin. The Russians got there, and basically the commander stood back and said, "Do what you want to do," to the troops, and there was a massive, months-long series of ongoing rapes and murders and dreadful sort of torturings and all kinds of things just happened. The Americans, when they did arrive, were like, okay, our Russian allies, and the reason is that it was payback for the way the Germans had treated the Russians as they moved into the Untermenschen, as they call, the undermen, the non-people, as they moved into Ukraine and Russia, Belarus and Russia. And there was as the Germans moved, they left behind them just a terrible swath of destruction and rape and burnings and slaughters, and the assaults on civilians were just dreadful. Especially once they got out of the sort of the Allied territory, quote unquote Allied territory, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and so on, which were maintained, were able to sort of at least maintain some kind of statehood because they were possessed by the Nazis. But anyway, so have a look at this book. They made a movie out of it with Nina. Can't remember her name. She's a good actor. She actually is German, and it's just called. I think it's just called A Woman in Berlin. I'll find it for you and put it up here. And it's not particularly gruesome or graphic. I mean, it's really it's more about like, how do you survive in an environment like this? She's a young woman, and she knows, like the women who are living in Berlin know very well. They're terrified of the Soviets arriving, justly so. And they're very much hoping to be able to surrender to the Americans, because they've heard that the Americans don't engage in rape. Well, presumably not to the extent that the Soviets did. I mean, I'm sure. Anyway. So Riverbend says, it's strange what you can get used to hearing or seeing. The first time is always the worst. The first time you experience cluster bombs. I will put up an image of what these are. The first time you feel the earth shudder beneath you with the impact of an explosion. The first tanks firing at houses in your neighborhood. The first checkpoint, the first broken windows, crumbling walls, unhinged doors, the first embassy being bombed, the first restaurant. It's not that you no longer feel rage or sadness. This just becomes part of life, and you grow to expect it, like you expect rain in March and sun in July. And so this is the weather, basically, of the war. And it's talk about going to condition orange. I mean, this is condition red, right? Because when you've had one of these things, you're completely you have no agency over this stuff whatsoever. The soldiers want to have agency, and at least they have some. I mean, they're targets, but they also have training. They have the group around them. They have the weapons. They have support behind them. So this, and they have chosen one way or another. They've decided to be there and not to say no, like they haven't said, because soldiers could say, "Yeah, I'm not going. I'm not." And then they're like, "Okay, well, it's prison for you." It's like, "Okay, yeah, put me in prison. I'm not going to do this. I'm not." And some people did do that. Some people said, "Yeah, I'm out. I'll be a nightmare for you. I will make myself into a PR nightmare for you." And a lot of people were quietly let go because it was clear that they were going to become a serious problem to the military. Okay, but the point is that these people have no control whatsoever over what's going to happen. The military comes and goes, it does its operations or not. They have no idea. Nobody's going to tell them. Nobody's going to tell them what happened. If a tank rolls into the neighborhood and takes out a house and then rolls on, it's like, that's what happened. They're just hoping it's not going to be them, and then hoping that their friends didn't get killed. And what was the issue? You never know. So it's not as though the Americans came back and said, "Oh, we wiped out building X because," it's like, no, you don't tell civilians what you're doing in a war zone. I am constantly reminded, she says, of the 3,000 Americans who died that day. This is 9/11. And asked to put behind me the 8,000 worthless Iraqis we lost to missiles, tanks, and guns on 46. And this is exactly right. That at this point, it's only 8,000. We're now above 200,000 people. So, as I've said, I've been pointing you to Iraq body count, which I did a couple of lectures ago. And we are American soldiers to date. Now, this was a number of years ago. I think it's now 5,000. I'm afraid it may actually be more like 8,000. It's a relatively high number. It's not as bad as Vietnam, but that's hardly saying anything, right? So the numbers in the thousands. My memory is 5,000 to 6,000 troops at the moment killed in Iraq, American troops. With, at the time, this is 2015, 100,000 wounded. 100,000 wounded. That's like a third of London, or all of, I don't know how big is how many people are in Hamilton, or one of those smaller towns. Well, Hamilton's pretty big. She also is attacked in the ugliest kind of language by Americans who write to her, and then she puts their writings up because they write to her these poison pen letters. That I was naive and probably spoiled, etc., and that, quote, "not one single American soldier deserves to die for you." I completely agree. She says, "No one deserves to die for me or for anyone else," on 15. It's just so reasonable. It's just like, would an American, would a 25-year-old American woman in South Carolina say, "No soldier deserves to die for me"? Would they understand? Would they get it? I'm not convinced. I haven't seen that kind of thoughtfulness in people. They sort of just take it for granted that their lives are worth more than everybody else's life. What if, just what if, Iraq actually wasn't looking for saving by the United States? And never again is, what the people who are engaged in genocide studies say, but really, who's going to remember, really, right? And this is the point. This is why I talked about Hitler with the Armenians, right? Who remember said, whether he said it or not, it's gone into history. Who, after all, remembers the annihilation of the Armenians? But she says, but I haven't forgotten. I remember February 13th, 1991. I remember the missiles dropped on Almeria. Pardon me. I remember the missiles dropped on Almeria. That's right, shelter, a civilian bomb shelter in a populated residential area in Baghdad. Bombs so sophisticated, the first one drilled through to the heart of the shelter, and the second one exploded inside. The shelter was full of women and children. Boys over the age of 15 weren't allowed, on page 46. This is true, and here are a couple of pictures of Amria, which are, because it's been preserved in Iraq as a memorial site, basically. The problem is, and this is sort of one of the typical things of the difference between the way the Americans or we, I suppose, North Americans, the West, would preserve something is that you would actually cut out these things and reconstruct it so that it's safe. But actually what they've done is preserve the original site so you can actually go and visit it. But it's dangerous because it might cave in. So it's one of these, it's a very different, it's a fascinating take on sort of like what, yes, you have to have a memorial, but this memorial is truly dangerous. So we engage yet again in trying to distinguish between the lies and truth in war in Iraq, because who, after all, remembers the bombing of Amria? At the time, it was a huge deal. It wasn't, I mean, people said, oh, that's a hoax. It's like, no, there were these pictures and there are these terrible handprints on the ceiling because people burned to death, right? And of course, if they burned it, if there was a bad fire in an underground shelter, it means that people suffocated. So there are these greasy handprints, obviously, as people were burning to death. They put their hands up on the ceiling of the shelter.